911, what's your emergency?
There are some stories that seem too unbelievable to be real. Stories so dark, so twisted that they feel more like the stuff of Hollywood thrillers than anything that could actually happen in real life. This is one of those stories. Don't forget that every second counts when unraveling mysteries and uncovering the truth. If you're truly passionate about real-time crime stories and want to stay ahead of the curve, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join the real-time crime 911 community today. Thank you. A Texas judge, someone we expect to be the very embodiment of justice, decides that the rules no longer apply to her. Married to a respected cop, living in a house full of privilege, power, and respect, she has everything she could ever want. But all of that means nothing when she gets caught up in an affair with a man from a much darker world, a former criminal, someone with a past so ugly it could send shivers down anyone's spine. What could she possibly have seen in him? How did her perfect world get so corrupted? And how far would she go to keep this dangerous relationship alive? The answer, as it turns out, is chilling. She hires a hitman to kill her own husband, a man who had sworn to protect her, who had dedicated his life to keeping others safe, who had built their life together on the foundation of trust and love. And she does it not because she wants to be free, but because she wants to continue her affair. She wants money to fund it. She wants to be with someone who has nothing but a past full of crime. And in her mind, the only way to make all of this work is through murder. How does someone like this, a judge, someone who's trusted by everyone around her, end up in such a cold, calculated mess? What could possibly drive someone in her position, someone who holds so much power, to destroy the very life they've built? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how does a woman so wrapped in her own lies, so immersed in the darkest parts of her own desires, believe she can escape the consequences of her actions? But this story doesn't end with a simple murder. Oh no. This is where it all begins to unravel. What starts as a perfect crime quickly turns into a chaotic mess of secrets, lies, and betrayals. The walls begin to close in. The judge, desperate to cover her tracks, takes more risks, more drastic steps. But the deeper she digs, the harder it becomes to bury the truth. Every lie, every deception only brings the truth closer to the surface. And as the investigation into her husband's death unfolds, the shocking truth begins to emerge. How far will she go to protect herself? Will she succeed in hiding her darkest secret? Or will she be caught in the web of her own making? As the detectives dig deeper, as they uncover more and more of the twisted tale she's woven, one thing becomes clear. No one, not even someone with the power of a judge, can outrun the consequences of their actions forever. How does someone who represents the law, someone who is supposed to enforce it, decide to break it in the most violent, most shocking way possible? What drives this woman to kill her husband, a man she spent years building a life with just to fund an affair? And what's worse, what drives her to believe she can get away with it? This story is about more than just one murder. It's about the lengths people will go to when they believe they can escape the consequences. It's about the corruption of a person we all trust to uphold the law, someone who decides that their own desires are worth more than the lives of those around them. But the real question is, how far will she go to protect herself from the law that she once served? Grace Bennett was, by all accounts, the epitome of success. A respected judge in a quiet Texas town, she had spent years climbing the ranks of the legal world, earning a reputation for being fair, impartial, and unwavering in her pursuit of justice. To the people who knew her, she was the embodiment of what a judge should be: calm, composed, and always in control. She was the one who held the power to determine people's fates. In her courtroom, she was untouchable. But what few saw behind that black robe, the robe that symbolized her power and prestige, was a woman who was far from flawless. Then there's James. To the outside world, Grace and James Bennett were the perfect couple. She, the successful judge, and he, a dedicated cop. Two people who had built a life together that others could only dream of. Their marriage was the stuff of small-town legends, a union that represented strength, loyalty, and unwavering support. On paper, they were everything they were supposed to be, a power couple who made it look effortless. But the truth, as always, was far more complicated. James was a cop, a man who had spent his career keeping the peace and serving his community. He was hardworking, dedicated, and protective, but over the years, his work began to take its toll. He was always away, more than he ever had been. Calls, late shifts, and investigations that never seemed to end. In the beginning, Grace tried to tell herself it was just part of the job. She understood. But the longer it went on, the more she felt the space between them grow. The conversations, once flowing easily between them, became fewer and fewer. The warmth they had once shared in the quiet moments of the evening, those talks about their day, their hopes, their shared future, was replaced with the sound of silence. James came home tired, distant, and consumed by the latest case that had taken all of his energy. Grace, too, became consumed by her own work, by her own need to prove herself. They were both busy, but they were no longer connected. Slowly, the marriage that had once been the foundation of their lives began to feel more like a cold, empty shell. The tension between them didn't erupt overnight. It was subtle, a gradual shift that neither of them fully acknowledged at first. But Grace began to feel it in the small moments. The look James gave her as he walked out the door for yet another late night. The way he no longer noticed the things she'd done for their home, for their life together. And then there was the lack of touch, the absence of affection. Their marriage, once full of promise and love, was beginning to wither, and neither knew how to stop it. It wasn't long before Grace began to feel the consequences of that distance. She could no longer ignore the emptiness that had settled into their home. The house that once felt alive with their shared dreams now seemed hollow, echoing with the silence of two people who were no longer truly present for each other. Grace, used to controlling every aspect of her life, found herself feeling helpless. She began to wonder if the life she had fought so hard to build was worth the price she had paid. There had to be more to life than this, didn't there? James, lost in his work, never noticed how much Grace is changing. He couldn't see the way she was retreating into herself, seeking something to fill the hole he had left in their marriage. As he threw himself into his cases, more crime, more violence, more late nights, he became less of the man she had married, and more of a shadow. This growing distance between them created a void, one that Grace could no longer ignore. The career that had once given her purpose no longer filled her the way it had. The marriage that had seemed unbreakable now felt fragile, slipping through her fingers. And when something is slipping away from you, you begin to seek anything that can bring back the feeling of being alive. Anything to escape the weight of that emptiness. And it was at that moment, when she was most vulnerable, that she met Marcus Devereaux. Marcus Devereaux was everything James wasn't. Where James was predictable, steadfast, a man of duty, Marcus was spontaneous, unpredictable, a man with a past so colorful it could have been pulled from the pages of a crime novel. A former criminal, Marcus had spent time behind bars before he decided to turn his life around. The town spoke of him in hushed tones, casting a wary eye on his every move. But to Grace, he was a spark in the dark. He didn't see her as a judge, as someone to be respected or revered. He saw her as a woman, a real, flawed person, and in that moment, Grace found herself drawn to him. It all started innocently enough. At a local charity event, an affair that was meant to be nothing more than a formality, an obligatory evening to maintain the appearance of civility, Grace met Marcus Devereaux. He was there, of course, not because he was part of the social elite, but because, despite his criminal past, he had somehow been invited. The invitation had been extended due to his efforts to rehabilitate himself and contribute to society in ways that weren't immediately obvious. But there was something magnetic about him, a rawness that others couldn't quite place, that Grace couldn't quite shake off. Marcus wasn't the kind of man people in her circle would associate with. He wasn't a lawyer, a business executive, or a man who operated within the law. His past was checkered, tainted with violent offenses, addiction, and a history of criminal behavior that had led him down a path of incarceration. He had spent years in prison for armed robbery and assault, but had since made an effort to change his life. He was now attempting to reintegrate into society, holding down a humble job at a local garage. He was working hard to shed the identity of his past, a man defined by crime. But it was his past, his dark history, that intrigued Grace. The enigma of his life, how someone could go from being on the wrong side of the law to trying to walk the straight and narrow, was something that caught her interest. What was it about him that made Grace, with her life built on the very foundation of law and order, unable to resist him? Perhaps it was his confidence. Perhaps it was his complete indifference to her status, her power, her title. For Grace, this was new. She was used to being in control, the one with the authority. But Marcus didn't see her as the judge, as the woman everyone respected and feared. He saw her as a person, someone broken, someone looking for a way to escape the rigid walls of her perfect life. The nature of Marcus's past was something he didn't shy away from. He never hid it, never downplayed it. He told her the truth about who he was, how he had hurt people, how he had found himself in prison, how he had learned hard lessons along the way. There was no pretense. He was unapologetically himself. In a world where Grace had perfected the art of masking her true self, pretending to be someone she wasn't, his brutal honesty was both jarring and intoxicating. There was no denying the chemistry between them from the moment they first spoke. It was palpable, undeniable. His presence made Grace feel alive in ways she hadn't in years. For a long time she had been a judge, a beacon of law and justice, and she had buried every personal desire beneath the weight of her title. But in Marcus's gaze, in his touch, she felt something different. He saw her for who she was beneath the judge's robe, the woman who longed to feel something, to be seen. But she also knew that getting involved with someone like him, someone with a criminal history, could ruin everything: her career, her marriage, the entire life she had spent so many years building. But despite these warnings, Grace couldn't stop herself. The affair started small, just casual meetings in dark corners, quick, heated exchanges behind closed doors. But as with any affair that begins with such intensity, the stakes quickly grew. What began as flirtation soon spiraled into something much deeper, much more dangerous. As the affair with Marcus deepens, Grace begins to feel the walls closing in. Every secret meeting with him, every stolen moment, begins to take a toll on her. The lie she has built, the picture-perfect marriage, the public respect she commands, the legal authority she wields, starts to crumble under the weight of her own actions. But the deeper she sinks into this dangerous liaison, the more desperate she becomes. There is no turning back now. She needs a way out, and it has to be clean, perfectly executed. The affair cannot be exposed. The disgrace of her betrayal cannot come to light. And yet, she finds herself at a crossroads, with no easy escape from the web she's entangled in. It is in this moment of vulnerability, when her need to escape everything she's built becomes unbearable, that Grace turns to someone she should never have even considered. Someone who could help her sever the ties that bind her to the life she no longer wants. Her desperation leads her to a man named Victor Calloway. Calloway wasn't new to the world of crime, but he wasn't a professional hitman either. He was, however, someone who had gained a reputation for doing dirty work for the right price. A low-level criminal with a background of theft, drug dealing, and a few run-ins with the law, Victor was someone who lived on the fringes of society. But he wasn't unfamiliar with the type of work Grace had in mind. His history of violence made him the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate when asked to kill someone. Grace's first contact with Victor wasn't by accident. She had known of him for a while through Marcus. There had been whispered conversations between the two lovers about Marcus's own dealings with the criminal underworld. Businesses run on the wrong side of the law, debts owed, dangerous favors. She had been reluctant at first, but Marcus had reassured her. Victor was trustworthy. He would do what was asked, no questions asked. The transaction was simple, cold, calculated, and void of emotion. Grace's need to rid herself of her husband, James, had become an obsession. It was no longer about love, nor even about Marcus. It was about survival. She could no longer live with the burden of a life she had never truly wanted. James had to die for her to be free. Free to love Marcus openly. Free to build a future with him without the constraints of her marriage, her career, or her reputation. Victor Calloway didn't ask questions. He didn't care about her reasons. All that mattered to him was the price. He could provide a clean job. He could eliminate James, and he could do it without drawing attention. For Grace, that was all she needed to hear. She handed him the money, made the arrangements, and sealed her fate. There was no remorse, no hesitation. Grace had been playing this dangerous game for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to truly feel anything at all. Her mind was made up, and in that moment, she viewed the murder as nothing more than a necessary step in her journey toward freedom. With the hitman in place, the next phase of the plan was execution. Grace couldn't afford to make mistakes. She had to keep everything in her life, her public image, her career, her status, intact. The murder needed to look like a random act of violence, a senseless killing that would leave no trail back to her. She began to craft a meticulous plan, one that would eliminate her husband without arousing suspicion. Victor wasn't someone who worked in the shadows. He needed to know the ins and outs of the situation. Where would James be? What time of day was he most vulnerable? How could the crime be carried out without alerting anyone? These questions swirled in Grace's mind as she carefully laid out the details. She had to make sure everything was in place, every detail aligned. It was clear to Grace that she couldn't do this alone. She had to manipulate her way through every detail. She began with small acts, leaving James at the office late, setting up dinner plans that would keep him away from home, arranging for him to go to a local bar on a night she knew he wouldn't be cautious. She needed to establish a routine for him, a pattern that wouldn't raise suspicion. The evening had unfolded just as Grace had planned. James, blissfully unaware of the danger awaiting him, walked into the bar, greeting a few colleagues, ordering his usual drink, and making small talk about the day's events. The night felt like any other, but beneath the surface, something far more sinister was in motion. Outside, hidden in the shadows, Victor Calloway waited, patient, focused. He wasn't nervous. This was his job. He'd done things like this before, and tonight would be no different. As James stood at the bar engrossed in his conversation, Victor slipped through the alley, keeping to the dark, and positioned himself at the door. A quick glance to make sure no one was watching, and then it happened. A single shot rang out. James crumpled to the ground, the glass in his hand shattering against the floor as he fell. His colleagues rushed to him, but it was too late. By the time they'd realized what was happening, he was already gone. Back at her home, Grace sat in her living room, feigning shock as the news broke over the TV. A cop, her husband, had been murdered. The first few reports suggested it was a robbery gone wrong, but Grace knew better. She had done this. She had orchestrated this. Detectives were immediately dispatched to the crime scene. The local department, led by Detective Greg McAllister, began their search for answers. At first, it appeared to be a botched robbery. The killer had used a firearm, quickly fled the scene, and there were no signs of forced entry or theft. But as McAllister looked over the details, something felt wrong. There was no clear motive for James's murder. He wasn't the kind of cop who made enemies, at least none that anyone could easily identify. The first task was to canvass the area. Investigators spoke to the witnesses who had been at the bar when the shooting occurred, but their statements only led to more questions. Some had heard the shot, but no one saw anything. A man in a hooded jacket had been seen in the alleyway, but there were no clear details about his appearance. No clear suspect. The pieces didn't fit. The detectives turned their focus on the victim's personal life. If this wasn't a random crime, then it was something more personal. They spoke to James's colleagues, family, and friends, hoping to uncover any leads. But everyone said the same thing. James had a perfect life. There was no reason for anyone to want him dead. At least that's what they all thought. Grace, of course, was the grieving widow, and her reaction was scrutinized by investigators. At first, nothing seemed out of place. She seemed genuinely distraught, a woman in shock from the sudden loss of her husband. But the more they dug into James's life, the more questions emerged. How long had the two been married? What was their relationship really like? It didn't take long for Grace to become a person of interest. The investigators found that James had been acting strangely in the weeks before his death. He had seemed withdrawn, agitated at times. The couple had reportedly been having issues, though nothing serious enough to warrant the thought of murder. But it didn't stop the detectives from wondering. Was this all an act? And then there was the affair. Rumors began to swirl. Grace's close relationship with Marcus began to surface. Though nothing could be definitively proven yet, those who knew Grace began to raise their eyebrows. Was there more to this tragedy than just a random act of violence? Detective McAllister wasn't willing to let this case go cold. His gut told him that there was more to James's death than it seemed. He had no solid evidence, no smoking gun. But something about Grace felt off. He couldn't shake the suspicion that she was hiding something. What had really happened behind closed doors? Why was Grace so calm, so composed? As the investigation intensified, the detectives began to piece together small clues. Texts, phone records, and sightings of Grace in places where she shouldn't have been. Every detail mattered now. They were closing in on something, but the question was, would they find the truth before Grace could cover her tracks? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you won't miss out on more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. As Detective Greg McAllister and his team continued to sift through evidence, it became clear that this case wasn't going to be easy. With each step forward, it seemed they were 2 steps back. The more they learned, the more the case splintered in unexpected directions, twisting in ways they hadn't anticipated. What seemed to be a straightforward murder investigation turned into something far more tangled, full of false leads, dead ends, and more than one suspect to keep in mind. Each red herring seemed to lead nowhere, but they all contributed to a mounting sense of frustration among the detectives. However, despite the constant distractions, McAllister had one thing in his favor: his gut feeling that Grace was hiding something. At first, the investigation into the judge was cautious. They were careful not to make any accusations without solid evidence. Grace's position in the community, her reputation as a respected judge, and her public mourning made it difficult to press too hard. But the more they uncovered about her life, the more they realized that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Among the many twists was the emerging figure of Marcus, the former criminal. At first, investigators weren't sure what to make of him. He was a man with a criminal record, trying to reintegrate into society after serving time for various offenses. His past made him a suspect by default, but the connection between him and Grace had been murky at best. What seemed at first like a simple affair now took on a new dimension. Could Marcus be the mastermind behind James's murder? Did he have something to gain from it? Was he pulling the strings all along? As McAllister reviewed the phone records, text messages, and surveillance footage, a chilling realization began to form. Grace wasn't as careful as she thought. The two had communicated frequently in the weeks leading up to the murder, more than anyone had realized. But one detail stood out above the rest. The two had spoken on the very day James was killed. Not only had Grace been in contact with Marcus in the hours before the murder, but the phone records also revealed she had called a local hitman, Victor Calloway, several times in the days leading up to James's death. The chilling thing was, these calls had been deliberately hidden, erased or disguised in ways that seemed far too intentional. The hitman had been careful, his work professional, but there was one slip-up, something that was starting to seem far less accidental. McAllister and his team began digging deeper into Victor's background. They discovered that Victor had in fact worked with Marcus before, and though he had a reputation for discretion, there were signs that his involvement might have been more than just a paid job. The investigators started to wonder, had the hitman been brought in on a promise, or was he being used as a pawn in a much larger scheme? As the investigation moved forward, it became increasingly clear that Grace wasn't just an accomplice. She was deeply entwined in the entire conspiracy. She had been manipulating the situation, maneuvering the pieces around, and using everyone around her for her own benefit. At the heart of it all, her desire for control, for the money and for the power of a second chance at love, had clouded her judgment. But what she didn't count on was how far the investigation would go. By now, Grace's situation was becoming more precarious. What began as an effort to cover her tracks had turned into a battle for survival. As the walls closed in, Grace's desperation grew, and her attempts to escape the noose tightened. The web she had so carefully woven around her life was beginning to unravel, and every decision she made now felt like one made in haste, fueled by panic. She began to make risky moves, thinking she could outsmart the law, thinking that the investigation could be contained, at least long enough to clear her name. Grace reached out to old contacts, people who could potentially influence the investigation, people who might help her get out of this mess. She knew the judge's reputation was at stake, and as long as her involvement remained hidden, she could still protect her career. In one of the most chilling moments of her story, Grace made contact with a high-profile criminal defense attorney, someone known for taking on the most high-stakes cases and winning them. It seemed like an innocent enough move, until the attorney's name popped up on a surveillance log just a few days after James's murder. Her decision to hire someone so well-connected raised eyebrows. Was she trying to manipulate the justice system? Was she trying to buy her way out of this? The pressure was mounting on Grace, and it was showing in her behavior. She became more erratic, more prone to making rash decisions, all in the hope of keeping her secret buried. But the more she tried to cover her tracks, the more vulnerable she became. The people she reached out to weren't always the friends she thought they were. Meanwhile, Marcus was starting to realize the magnitude of what he had been dragged into. His initial involvement in the affair had been motivated by passion, but now the consequences of their actions were closing in on him. The heat was on both of them, and it became clear that Marcus wasn't willing to go down alone. Then the breakthrough came. It happened in the most unexpected way. During a routine search of the judge's office, it wasn't a major tip that led to the discovery, but rather a small, overlooked detail. A single piece of paper buried under a stack of legal documents. It was an old contract. The paper itself seemed insignificant, but on closer inspection, the contract detailed a financial transaction, a payment to Victor Calloway, the hitman, signed off by Grace herself. The signature was unmistakable. There it was, in black and white. Grace had paid for James's murder. The amount wasn't trivial. It was substantial enough to raise questions about how far Grace was willing to go to make her dream life a reality. McAllister's heart raced as he realized the enormity of this find. This was it, the final piece that tied Grace directly to the crime. For a moment, it felt like the world stood still. Everything had been building to this moment. A single slip-up, a small piece of evidence, and suddenly everything was clear. With the hitman's involvement now confirmed, McAllister knew he had Grace. There was no more room for doubt. The walls were closing in. But just as the detectives prepared to confront her with the damning evidence, Grace's calculated mind went to work again. She knew her time was running out, and she would stop at nothing to protect herself. But McAllister's team had already put the pieces together. Grace had thought she could outsmart everyone, but now it was too late. As McAllister and his team gathered the evidence to bring Grace in for questioning, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. They had everything they needed. The case was solid. The judge, the woman who had so carefully crafted her image of justice and authority, was about to face the consequences of her actions. The moment Grace walked into the courtroom, the weight of the world seemed to press down on her. The woman who had once sat high in her judicial seat, making decisions that affected the lives of countless individuals, now stood at the center of a courtroom, fighting for her own life. The judge who once wielded the power of the law was now facing the crushing reality that her own crimes could bring her to the edge of a lifetime in prison. The atmosphere was electric, thick with tension as her trial began, and the community that had once revered her now watched, wrapped with disbelief. The trial unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Everyone could see it coming, but no one could look away. Grace's defense was as calculated as everything she had done up to that point. She stuck to her story, maintaining a level of control even in the face of damning evidence. Her lawyers, once champions of her reputation, now had to argue a case based on the manipulation of the truth. They tried to paint Grace as a victim, of a marriage gone wrong, of a man who had been emotionally distant, of a criminal who preyed upon her vulnerability. But no amount of polished rhetoric could hide the truth that had already been laid bare. Grace had planned and executed the murder of her own husband, and she had done it for love, for money, and for control. During the trial, the affair was thrust into the public eye, further stripping away the carefully constructed facade of her life. Witnesses testified about the late-night phone calls, the secret meetings between Grace and Marcus, the twisted emotional bond that had flourished under the guise of a professional judge. The courtrooms buzzed with the whispers of the community, some in disbelief, others in anger at the betrayal of someone they had trusted. The hitman, Victor Calloway, was also brought to the stand. His demeanor was cold, detached, as if he were recounting the events of a business transaction rather than the taking of a life. It was chilling to watch, as his words painted a picture of a well-organized plan, one executed with a professional's precision. Calloway's testimony, combined with the evidence, phone records, bank statements, and a signed contract for the murder, seemed to seal Grace's fate. He described how he had been paid handsomely for the job and how he had executed it without a second thought, just another assignment for a woman who had seemed so composed, so untouchable. But the most gut-wrenching testimony came from Grace's colleagues. Her fellow judges, who had once held her in the highest regard, were forced to face the betrayal on a level that was almost unimaginable. They spoke of their shock, of their confusion, as they watched the woman they had worked beside, the woman they had trusted, fall from Grace. One colleague in particular, a close friend of James, spoke with tears in his eyes. He described the loss of not only a partner in the legal world, but the death of a friend and a family member. For him, the trial was a personal reckoning with the betrayal of someone who had once seemed so honorable. As the trial drew to a close, the courtroom was filled with the emotional weight of the consequences. Grace's defense team fought valiantly, but they were up against overwhelming evidence. There was no escaping the truth, and in the end, it was the truth that mattered most. The jury deliberated for hours, though the outcome seemed all but certain. Finally, the moment came, the moment when the judge, who had once been at the top of her career, stood in front of the court, waiting for the verdict that would seal her fate. The verdict was swift. Guilty. Grace was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice had been served, but it was cold comfort in the face of such a profound betrayal. The hitman, Victor Calloway, was also convicted, though his sentence was less severe. He had only been following orders, but the law didn't see it that way. His fate was sealed, and his role in the crime was irrevocable. Marcus, the former criminal who had played a central role in the affair, was sentenced to a lengthy prison term as well. His once promising life had been destroyed by his own involvement in a plot that had spiraled out of control. Thank you for joining us as we've uncovered the chilling details of a case that shook not just the state of Texas, but the entire nation. We followed a path of deception, manipulation, and unthinkable violence, and as we close this chapter, we're left to ponder the haunting question of how far someone will go when they're consumed by greed, love, and power. We want to hear from you. Your thoughts, your theories, your take on what really happened, leave them in the comments below. If you found this case as shocking and unsettling as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you won't miss out on more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.